Okay? So I want to speak today about living in uncertain times. And I wanted to start with a fable. And the fable is about two friends who are taking a walk in the evening, and one of them points up to a mountain, and he says to his friend, you know, up there, there's a person who lives up there who's taken himself out of the ways of the world, and all he does is seek to find God. And they walk a little ways longer, and the second fellow turns to his friend and he says, you know, he's never going to find God up there. He's not going to find God until he comes down here and experiences with us our joys and our pains. He's not going to find God until he dances at a wedding and cries at a funeral. And when I read that, am I allowed to walk over here? When I read that, it reminded me. I have a book. We have a book at home by the late head of the Western Sufis, and he's got a really long name, so I won't try to mangle it. But in his book, he says, you know, earning a living, navigating relationships, dealing with illnesses, he said those aren't blocks to spiritual illumination. They're not roadblocks. In fact, he gave them a name. I really love this name. He says they're creative catalysts for spiritual evolution. Creative catalysts for spiritual evolution. He said what really the spiritual path is about is how we deal with events in our life day to day. And that's, I think, the same point of that fable. You know, it's Ernest Holmes talks about this too, that you don't have to sit in the cave and meditate all day to find spiritual illumination. It's a lot, really, when you think about it, it's a lot harder to do what we do every day to find spiritual illumination. You know, to go out and work and deal with whatever we have to deal with, rather than just sitting and meditating. That's pretty easy. So Lama Surya Das is a Buddhist teacher, and he makes a point, again, kind of like this in one of his books. He said, you know, most of the time, if we think about a hero, if we think about heroism, we think about it in the physical sense, you know, muscles, you know, athletes, etc. And he said, but it's also about inner strength. It's also about people that have unexpected loss and difficulties in their life, that have to deal with fear and with doubt, and do that and still go on every day and do what needs to be done. They don't run from their fears. And he gives a whole bunch of examples. I want to give you a couple that he gives, and one from our life this week. So one of the examples he gives is about a woman named Margaret. And he says, Margaret is a widow, and she has a 9-year-old son that she takes care of, and a mother with Alzheimer's. And so every day Margaret has to get up, you know, get her kid dressed, get him fed, make his lunch, and get him out to the school bus. And every day Margaret pretty much has to do the same thing with her mom. Get her mom dressed, get her mom fed, and get her mom out to whatever it is, a bus or whatever that takes her to the daycare when Margaret goes to work. And she says, boy, do I wish I had a partner to help me through this. And somebody asks her, what's the most heroic challenge that you have in your life? And she said, my most heroic challenge is to remain cheerful and optimistic. And then he tells a story about another lady named Naomi. And he said, Naomi's got a blind date, and she's in panic. Because a year ago, we met on a blind date, so I know that panic. A year ago, she's in a panic because a year ago, she was engaged to somebody she knew since they were adolescents. And a week before the wedding, he came to her and he said, you know what? Our relationship is stale. And he broke up with her. And a couple of weeks later, he married somebody else that he had just met. And Surya Das says she's in really frantic about going out on this date, but she knows that she has to do it if she wants to open her heart and find love again. So she moves beyond that fear. And the other thing that happened, just to share this week, I have a daughter and two sons. And one of my sons, we have a real up and down. To this day, we've always had kind of like an up and down. Well, actually, when he was younger, we got along better. But we have a really up and down relationship. And the other night, Becky and I are sitting there in our living room, and my phone pings, and it's a private message from my son. And he wants to talk about an issue in his life that's really, really deep, that honestly we've never really talked about ever before. And we were pinging back and forth private messages for a long time. And I finally said to him, what brings this up now? And he wrote back, he said, I need to talk about it, and I trust you because you're my dad and I love you. And that's why he did it. And when we got all done, I turned to Becky and I said, what courage he had to open himself up the way he did to me. You know, so that's what Surya Das and they're all talking about that I was mentioning. Emmett Fox, the theologian, once wrote, do it trembling if you must, but do it. You know, we obviously we all know this. We don't get a script in life. You know, you don't start out with a script and know everything that's gonna happen. You know, but it's kind of interesting because if we did, we might be able, no matter what it was, we might be able to come to peace with it because we would have time to do that. But it also might be pretty boring too. I mean, imagine if you knew everything. I kept thinking about it. God, what if you get the message you're going to get hit by a car, you know, and that's how you're going to end. And you had to go on that street at that day, you know. But so if you knew it all, you wouldn't have any choice in your life, and you wouldn't have any opportunity to grow. So we really don't know what the future, bless you there, what the future holds for us. And the more we try to hold on to security, the more we wind up living in fear. And so really the only way to really live is to just be open to what life gives us. I saw this week, you know, when you drive on the highway, sometimes you'll see a sign and it says expect delays. And when you see that, you know what it means, right? You're gonna be stuck in traffic and you can moan and cry, but you're gonna be there for a while. Well, what if in life, every once in a while, you got this flashing sign that said expect change, You know, life is about change. People are born, people die. It's the flow of life. So, you know, I thought we could talk a little bit about some tips for coping. And one of them is to recognize that total security is an illusion. It's an illusion. Our life can change just like that on a dime. Our life can change on a dime, and uncertainty doesn't mean something is wrong. It just is. And so this is the story. I told Becky I was going to tell a story about her, but I wouldn't tell her what it was. So I want to give you an example of our life changing on a dime. One day, we lived in Southern California, and Becky worked for a guy who was middle-aged guy, millionaire, and he was a deadhead. You know what a deadhead is? Mm-hmm. No? A deadhead is somebody who follows the Grateful Dead. And this guy would follow them, you know the story now? This guy would follow them all over. So one day, I don't know where he was the night before, but he calls up Becky at work and says, come to John Wayne Airport and pick me up and take me to work. So Becky drives to John Wayne Airport and picks him up, and she's driving, it's in her car, she's driving him to work, and they're doing pleasantries, whatever. And then he turns to her and he says, by the way, when we get back to work, business isn't that good. I'm laying you off. Oh. Think about that, how, in a second, on a dime, your life change. 1 minute she's happy and, talking to him and everything, and the next minute he says, you're done. That's how life can change. And I just have to tell you, when she came home and she told me, she started to smile, and I said, what are you smiling about? She said, I was driving. It's a good thing for the two of us. I didn't crash the car. I was in such shock. But it happened. It's not a life-altering decision, but it sure hurt at the time. Another thing we can do is make a gratitude list. I've talked about this before, but when I was in the School of Ministry, my closest friend in the School of Ministry, her husband was a long-haul truck driver, and he was on a long haul, and he was breaking in a new driver, and I guess in the back of the cab they have beds, and her husband went to sleep to take a break, and when the young guy went to wake him up, he was dead, had a heart attack. You can imagine what a shock that is to my friend. And later on, we talked about it, and I asked her, I said, Carrie, what got you through it? Because she was shattered. And she said, I'll tell you what got me through it, Ron. I made a gratitude list. I forced myself every night for the first week before I went to bed to write down 5 things that I was grateful for. And at the end of the week, I looked at it, and I had 35 things to be grateful for, and that helped me get through it. We can, some other things, we can meditate. And I talked about community last week, so I won't go in it again deeply, but one of the things I didn't mention last week is that probably in a community, you're not the only one that's feeling what you're feeling. And there can be somebody there that understands, that can be with you. And I did say, they can tell you how they got through. And another thing we can do is prayer. And I read this week, I was reading a book by Rabbi Harold Kushner. And he said, and when he prays, he doesn't pray for things. He said he prays because invoking God's presence helps him to feel less alone. And he said one day a friend of his that's not Jewish asked him, what do Jewish people pray for? And Kushner said to him that when Jewish people pray, it's less a matter of praying for and more a matter of praying with and praying to. And then he talked about Martin Buber, and he said Martin Buber also said, we don't ask God for anything, we ask God for God. We invite God into our lives so we'll be guided by a sense of God's presence. So I told you that because I had an experience with prayer. Actually, I had two that I want to share. One is kind of funny. You know, Ed talked about the prayer box here. So we have actually a fairly long list of people that we're all praying for now. And so when I did the prayer for all of them, I kind of have them all memorized. When I did the prayer, something bugged me after I did it, and I kept thinking, I forgot somebody. I forgot somebody, and I couldn't remember who I forgot until I realized it was me. The other part of it is I had a really hard week. Physically, a couple of days I just was really sick to my stomach. And when that left, I had this general feeling of weakness. I woke up one day, my arms, my whole body felt really weak, and it was really scary to me. And to make it worse, they're repaving our entire development. And so you can't park near where you live, and so we had to walk a really long way. And one way, to give you an idea, I was so stressed about it, I actually told Becky, I'm taking my phone with me in case you need to call 911. That's how I was like feeling. So I did a prayer, and the reason I'm sharing it, when I started to pray, I realized that one of the great utilities of praying is to remember. It's to remember. It's not, you know, it's all the things that we talk about prayer, but it really brought me back to remembering, hey, wait a minute here, you know, you're not alone. You're not, you know I have Beck, but you're not alone. There's a higher power that's always with you. And so, you know, you can let go, give him the stress, or give God the stress, and you can move through this. Rabbi Kushner said, it's not God's job to heal a sick person. That's a doctor's job. God's job is to make you brave. Think about that. You know, Ernest Holmes said that we're mental beings, and we can think ourselves into being really miserable or being really happy, and realizing that there's this higher power. So why not use it? You know, and another thing, when we go through really bad times, sometimes in retrospect we look back and we could say, wow, that bad time led me to a much better place. You know, you lose a job and you find a better job. You blow a relationship and you find a much better relationship. You have an illness and you get to realize what's really important in your life. And you know, resilience is a set of behaviors that we can learn. It's not that some people are born with resilience and some people aren't. We learn it. So when we're going through a tough time, we can feel the feelings and then move beyond and know that in the end it's going to be okay. Eckhart Tolle wrote, when you become comfortable with uncertainty, infinite possibilities open up in your life. So I try once a month to do audience participation, to throw out a question and see if we could get some people to share. So I just wonder if anybody would be willing to share about a difficult time that they went through in their life, that upon looking back on it was a gift. Now, I primed two people with this, so they better raise their hands. Go ahead. You're not going to let me stand up here. Go ahead.
Well, I was in a 5-year relationship, and it was an unhealthy relationship. And the good thing about it was that he was the one who wanted to break it off. Well, at that time, I didn't have a job, and so it was really a place for me where there was, not only was I grieving the end of the relationship and how it ended, but also, what was I gonna do with my life? So I decided to start drawing again. I hadn't been using any of my art for several years. And as I was drawing, I was feeling a lot better about my situation. I was feeling a lot better about myself. And what happened was that I created a portfolio during that time, with several of my drawings. And it led to, eventually, when we met, you brought it to the art director at Mattel, and so that was, really encouraging, with how he reacted to my drawings. And it was the beginning of getting back into my art, which probably wouldn't have ever happened if that breakup hadn't occurred.
Thank you. Ed, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I got laid off from a job I had for over 20 years, and I was fairly happy there. But I was in my 50s at the time, and so I was kind of a little concerned about getting a new job. And one of my coworkers said to me, he said, with your attitude, he said, doors are gonna open. You'll just flow right into something better. And I was like, kind of taken aback by that, but said, I'm gonna have to keep that in mind, And before my 2 weeks notice was over, I had another job. It worked. That just keeping that attitude, keeping that in mind. It was like the first place I applied to was the perfect place. They wanted me, and I had this job even before my severance pay was out. And it was a great job. I loved it. I loved the people. And, it worked.
Thank you. Jenna?
So, I went to college later in my late 20s, and I got my undergraduate degree, and when I graduated, I felt like there was something more, that it wasn't enough, and there was something more. So, since my undergraduate degree was in business, I figured, well, I'll get a master's degree in business. So I took the GMAT test that you're supposed to take to get into graduate school, and completely flunked it. It's math. I don't do math. And so I was in this state of, okay, well, I know there's something next. I know there's something next. So do I take the class to teach you how to pass the GMAT? What do I do? What do I do? And one morning, and I was alone, one morning I was awakened by a very loud voice that said, it's time to go in the ministry. And I called up, and I was in ministerial school within the week.
Wow. Thank you, Jenna. Courtney?
When I was in my 30s, I was in a terrible accident. And I was really busy having a good time. And I shattered my leg in 9 places, which put me flat down for 2 years. And in that time, I got to start massage school, which led to me having my own day spa. And had that not happened, I never could have gone. The doctor I worked for would have never given me part-time, but my doctor said I had to have part-time. So it all just fell into place, because at that time you had to go to Orlando. So that meant, a part-time job instead of full-time. So there.
Oh, man, thank you, Courtney. I saw another hand.
So, when I was in my, mid-20s, my husband and I had decided we were gonna go back to graduate school. And I was ambivalent, it was more his plan than mine. But I had gotten an assistantship to go get my master's in engineering at North Carolina State. And the closer I got to the day we were going, the more dread I felt, because I didn't wanna get a master's in engineering. I felt so I did that already. I already went into something that I didn't want to do so that I could have a job. Why am I doing more of that? And I just got more and more anxious as the time got nearer. And I thought, well, I gotta do something here. So I started flipping through the catalog. And I found this little tiny paragraph buried in the School of Humanities that said, starting in year, I'm not gonna film the year because that'll give too much away. We're gonna start this program, a Masters of Technical Communications. I thought, technical communications, I wonder, so I got interested, I went and I talked to the advisor, they didn't even have a curriculum in the catalog, it was so new. I got her curriculum, I thought, God, this really looks interesting, I think this is what I wanna do. So I went to my advisor in engineering and I said, I want a minor in technical communications. Actually, what I wanted was a dual master's, but I said if I could use the electives, and cross-pollinate the electives, I could do this in 3 years. And he said, we'd prefer that you minor in a hard science. And I said, I prefer to run my own life, and you can have your assistantship, and I'm gonna go do my own thing. And I went and I studied technical communication. I had to pay for it on my own dime. And that decision did 2 things in my life. One, it actually opened up, and it's a lot longer story than we have today. It opened my path to spiritual development and growth. And it's unusual how that worked out. And it paved the way for me to do what I do now for a living. And so I got 2 huge things out of that decision. And I was just groping in the night, really, for something to keep me sane as I was gonna study engineering. I found this little thing.
Thank you, Barb. Frank?
Mine's actually occurring now. Next Sunday, my husband Steve and I will celebrate 41 years together.
Wow.
And then just a few weeks ago, I guess it's been a month now, we learned that he had pancreatic cancer, which initially thought, okay, it's fatal, it's always fatal. Well, since then, I've learned it's not always fatal, even though his is stage 4. And the blessing is we're as strong together now, or maybe even more so than we were before. I had fears, I'd be alone, but I've got my family here, and I've learned to appreciate that. And certain principles that I learned over the past have come back to mind. Like A Course in Miracles says, nothing real can be, excuse me, nothing real can be threatened, and nothing unreal exists. So, gets me going.
Thank you.
Oh, go ahead, Bill.
I was raised in a family of artists there is no God. I never questioned it. I had no religious higher power belief whatsoever, never even questioned it. And I would, it was like a place for everything is a place and well organized. Then I fell in love with somebody and just totally lost my freaking mind and got into so much pain that I went searching for a belief system and ended up walking into a religious science church in Sarasota. And for weeks, I would go in and almost fall asleep because I felt safe. But that pain led me into seeking out a belief system. And it was one of those, I thought I wasn't gonna live through it, but it was like, you come out with something better than before.
So anybody else? I don't want to cut people off.
I just want to echo that. I think that the pain people feel, whether it's anxiety or despair, guides you to find something.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the change.
Michael Beckwith says that people come to church because they're either pulled by pain or pushed by a vision. Or maybe I did it backwards. And I don't know a lot of people that go but for a vision. Most people really change their life when they're in pain, because if things are going well, you're not looking to change anything. And it reminded me of a story in one of Barbara DeAngelis's books. She talks about being on an airplane, and there was a young guy. I've told this story before, but there's a young guy sitting in front of her that had the window seat. She had, I guess she did too. And he had the shade up about this much. So he was sitting, going like this to look out the window. And she wrote about this for a couple of pages because it drove her nuts. In fact, we read this book in our book club. We actually sent her a question, what does it say about you that drove you so crazy? But she never got back to me. But she said it was like, the hostess came up to this guy and said, would you like me to, he said, no, I'm fine. And he sat there the entire flight, like contorting himself to look out the window. And the message that she said was, how many of us do that with our life, that just look through a small sliver instead of the big picture? And it just reminded me, you know, when you're going through a tough time, you could just look at it like it's just a tough time and it's you getting through it by yourself. Or you could look at it in a bigger way, you know, like when I was telling you about my prayer, that I remember, hey, wait a minute, Bob, you're not alone. And there's somebody else, something here, a power that's with you all the time. So I want to close. You know, I do a lot of reading to prepare these, and this quote, I've been, honestly, without exaggeration, I saw in 5 or 6 different articles. So many people quote this, and it's I'm going to end with it. It's a quote from Gilda Radner. Some of you might have seen this, but it's her quote, and she said, you know, she was dying at the time. She said, I wanted a perfect ending. Now I've learned the hard way that some poems don't rhyme and some stories don't have a clear beginning, middle, and end. Life is about not knowing, having to change, and taking a moment and making the best of it without knowing what's going to happen next. Ah, delicious ambiguity. God bless you. Have a great week, and thank you for being here.